Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for The Babysitter, My Summers with a Serial Killer. This is a true Massachusetts true crime story. And we're joined tonight by authors Liza Rodman and Jennifer Jordan. And I will read the synopsis of the book. Why not? Great. So growing up in Cape Cod in the 1960s, Liza Rodman was a lonely little girl. During the summers, while her mother worked days in a local motel and danced most nights in the Provincetown bars, her babysitter, the kind, handsome handyman at the motel where her mother worked, took her and her sister on adventures in his truck. He bought them popsicles, and together they visited his secret garden in the Truro woods. To Liza, he was one of a kind, or one of the few kind, understanding, and safe adults in her life. But there was one thing she didn't know. Their babysitter was a serial killer. Though Tony Costa's gruesome case made screaming headlines in 1969 and beyond, Liza never made the connection between her friendly babysitter and the infamous killer of numerous women, including 4 in Massachusetts, until decades later. Haunted by nightmares and horrified by what she learned, Liza became obsessed with the case. Now she and her co-writer Jennifer Jordan reveal a suspenseful portrayal of murderous madness in tandem with a child's growing loneliness, neglect, and despair, a narrative collision that will haunt you long after you finish it. And so Liza Rodman attended UMass Amherst in the late 1970s, and she received her Bachelor's of Art with a concentration in creative writing from Vermont College in 2005. She has balanced life as a mother, stepmother, writer, and tax accountant for more than 35 years. Liza and her husband have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and live outside of Boston. Jennifer Jordan, meanwhile, is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and screenwriter with decades of experience as a news anchor and investigative journalist. She has worked for NPR and PBS, and her work has also appeared in a variety of national and international newspapers and magazines. So about 120 of us currently. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Liza and Jennifer for joining us here tonight. And ladies, take a bow. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely, absolutely. So as I said, I have about 12 questions prepared. I'm ready to fire away here, and then we'll turn it over to the audience at the end and relay some of their comments and questions.
Great.
So first off, The Babysitter is written not only by 2 writers, but by 2 longtime friends. So how did this all happen?
Do you want me to take this one, Liza?
Go for it, honey.
Well, I was in my 2nd year at UMass, and I am a coffee snob, and I was making my French roast in the morning, and then all of a sudden I saw this coffee mug coming through my open door, and Liza was at the other end of it, asking if she could finally have a decent cup of coffee. And so that was 40-something years ago, and here we are. And I have since moved to Utah. I lived in Boston for 20 years after college. And I since moved to Utah, but whenever I'd visit Boston, I would stay with Liza and her husband. And one of those visits, we were tucked up on the couch, sipping our wine. And she said, I'm not sure I ever told you, but I was babysat by a serial killer when we lived in P-Town. And I was like, whoa, full stop. What do you mean you were babysat by a serial killer? And I said, by the way, that's the title of the book when you finally write it, is The Babysitter. So she struggled for years to write it, and it's a complicated narrative, as you know from having read the book. And so I was between projects at one point, and I called her up and I said, Liza, how about this? You're struggling with this story. It's a hell of a story. I want to help you do this. So, can I help you get this story on the page? And she burst into tears and said, I was afraid to ask you, and here we are.
And Liza, so when and how did you realize that Tony Costa, your babysitter, was a serial killer?
Well, I realized it. It's in the prologue of the book, when I had a series of dreams. I was having a series of nightmares, really violent, really complicated nightmares. And to figure them out, I started writing them down because that's what I do when I want to figure something out. And I was also finishing my bachelor's degree late in life. And so I was doing it sort of as part of what I was studying and writing it down in a journal. And then one night I had in my dorm room, because I was in one of those low residency programs. And in my dorm room, I had this, heart pounding, sweating nightmare where two men backed me up against the wall I was in the motel that my aunt had in Provincetown in the 60s in my little spaghetti strap nightgown. I was about 10 years old. And two men came with a gun and backed me right up against the wall and said, count to 4 in Italian. Close your eyes and count to 4. And I did. And when I opened them, they were gone. But finally, I recognized the perpetrator. So in all of these dreams that I've been having over about a year's time, I couldn't see the face of the person who was after me, but I was always running for my life. And in this dream, it was Tony. And so I went to my mother and I said, did something happen to me that you're not telling me? Because I'm a little famous for my dreams in my family. So my mother, rolled her eyes and said, you and your dreams. And I said, I'm dreaming about Tony Costa. And she said, well, let me think. I know he became a serial killer. And, this son becomes a dentist and this one becomes a doctor. And then this one became a serial killer. And I describe the moment oftentimes as a moment of sometimes things are so shocking that you have sort of an out-of-body experience where everything just slowed down and things started to line up in my head. Old memories, what I thought were imaginations, just stuff that had happened in my childhood that suddenly made sense. And when that happened, I started to research because I went looking for myself. And I describe it as that when I first, Google was not big. It was really just starting out. And I started Googling him, found a book, and I just never looked back.
And can we talk about the research that went into writing this book?
Mm-hmm.
So, what materials, sources, interviews, access to the investigations, how did you, and this book is sort of half memoir, half true crime.
Right.
The chapters alternate between Liza's story and Tony's story. So Liza, you're Liza, so you were able to tell your story, I imagine, fairly easily. But how did you research Tony's life and all the crimes that he committed?
Well, when I found the book on Google that I just mentioned, it was the original book that was written about the case in 1981. And I saw that the author, the guy's name was Leo D'Amour, and he had donated all of his papers when he died. He died by suicide. And he was also the guy who wrote Senatorial Privilege about the Kopechne case. So, and was a very sort of controversial guy. So when he died, he left all of his papers for all of his stuff to Kent State. And so through Google, I found all of his research and for instance, I asked the state of Massachusetts for the trial transcript. It was the first thing I did.
Sure.
They lost it. They couldn't find it. So I was stymied. And then when I went to Kent State, I started going to Kent State eventually to do research. And it took me 15 years to get through everything and to go back each time and write something and then realize I needed something else. And when I ended up at Kent State, there was the trial transcript. So I knew I was onto a treasure trove when I got to Kent State. So, and it took me 15 years. We had over 10,000 pages of research. I found in Kent State these cassette tapes that came apart in my hands that were interviews from the jail that they had done with Tony, both his lie detector, some from his lie detector, and then that which wasn't recorded, we had transcripts for. So we just had so much stuff. And I actually took those tapes and had them digitized for the library because it's too important. Some of them were unusable, which was too bad, but most of them I have in my arsenal. So we had so much. And then, of course, we did our own interviews. Once Jen came on board, we did our own interviews.
And Jen, do you want to chime in on that question?
Well, for me, it was, coming into this process 15 years after Liza had been digging through dusty boxes at Kent State was an incredible gift. I mean, I'm a forensic journalist, so I came into this and there is all the work that she had already done presented to me in boxes. And so we literally just, squirreled ourselves away and laid every single page out on the living room floor and started going through with our markers and finding what was just extra and repetitive, and then finding stuff that people hadn't seen or looked at for 40 years. And it was unbelievable for me to come in and basically just to have the 10,000 pages and then weave it into this true crime. This is what happened, and this is how we're going to grab you by the throat, if you pardon the expression, and not let you go, because it's an incredible memoir by itself. But then when you add in the actual words of the serial killer, the actual voice of the serial killer, his interviewers, the police, the various people who tried to, at that point, capture him on page for their books and failed. They all failed in their aims to write books at the time. And there we were 40 years later going, oh my God, this stuff is gold.
And we had Tony's writing too. We had his unpublished manuscript that Houghton Mifflin flatly refused.
Right.
And we had another manuscript from another gentleman who had done all the interviews that we found. And he wrote a book about it, never published. I had Tony's, personal effects, some of which I recognized were in those boxes.
Yeah.
We had just a ton of stuff.
And so is this the second book ever published about Tony?
This is the second book ever published about him. Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
that's accurate.
Interesting. Okay, so here's what drove me crazy. You did a good job with this. And I mean no disrespect to the police in general, but I think Provincetown had a pretty inept police department back in the 60s. So sorry to say. Well, first of all, Tony had all the red flags. The neighborhood pets would go missing, right? And his treatment towards women, he abused his wife, and he had weird sex fetishes, I guess. So anyway, he checks all these boxes of okay. But the other thing was he was just steeped in crime. He was like the town drug dealer. He was robbing pharmacies. And how was he able to get away with all these crimes, let alone the murders? I know the guy was a handsome guy, but my goodness, creepy behavior.
This is Jen's favorite question right here. She loves this question.
I get it.
And you're being polite in saying, I don't want to besmirch the Provincetown police, but it wasn't only Provincetown police. It was Truro police. It was Boston police. It was
Providence.
I mean, 4 police forces had an APB for this guy, had an alert, like look out for the guy, look out for the car. The Boston police found the car and found Tony in it and
let him go.
And never told P-Town or Truro or Providence that they found him. They just let him go. So it's just, and in fact, I have a buddy of mine on the Boston Police Force now, and I called her and I said, what do you think happened here? And she said, this day and age, it would be an internal investigation like that.
Right.
Why they let him walk away. So why they let him walk away 50 years ago, we'll really never know.
Well, I think communication was so, it just wasn't, yeah.
Everybody was, especially in P-Town, everybody was in the late 60s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, drunk, high, vacationing. Everyone's in their own little bubble. And Tony walked between the bubbles and they noticed him, but it was never, evidently never enough for anyone to say, okay, somebody's going to put a tail on this guy.
Well, they did eventually, but it wasn't until they found the first body.
And also,
And that was the state police.
He didn't kill strangers.
Right.
He knew every single one of his victims. And that alone, that his girlfriends were disappearing. And the big line, even from one of the victims' mothers, was when she was asked 6 months later, when the body was found, why didn't you ever report your daughter as missing? She said, kids these days.
Right.
They come, they go. So it was really a product of the times, as well as everybody's kind of collective blindness, ignorance. And, as I said, they were all in their own dysfunctional bubble. So he just was able to be walking among the zombies.
Well, his family was well known too. His
Right.
family was really well known in town. And so that gives you a license in a small town like that to strut the streets.
Right.
And of course it wouldn't be so-and-so. And don't forget, there was no such thing as a serial killer.
Right.
Even in the face of the Boston Strangler, there wasn't that kind of language. So I think, that had a lot to do with it. I think people protected him.
And he was a father of
Right.
3. He was a husband. So if people even had suspicions, they were like, oh, well,
And he
Tony-
was normal. He had a normal side too, which he could turn on and off, which we later learned is a characteristic of a sociopath. They know how to turn it on and off. They know what you're looking for.
It's every other chapter was an introduction of a new crime that he commits, and it was just so frustrating. The whole time I'm like, where's the police? And yes, the local police, the state police, just any police. Oh boy.
When I was in Provincetown this last weekend, when they canceled the book event, I called the police because I was concerned for our people's safety. And the gentleman who answered the phone was a name I recognized from Provincetown. And he was a detective. And he said, I'll have them do a couple of extra drive-bys, but I've only got 2 guys on tonight. And I thought to myself, you only had 2 guys on in 1969. It's
Right.
the same, does anything ever change? So it's a small town.
Guys on at the height of the season in Provincetown. And the population 50 years ago was a fraction of what it is today, and they have 2 guys on.
So we will touch on that canceled book launch you just referenced, but I first want to touch on something you just talked about, where he had the ability to be normal and kind of turn it on and off. So how difficult was it writing characters, particularly Tony, who had both a heinous side and a sympathetic side? Did you struggle with that at all?
Well, let me take this one, Liza, because he did. Because I came at this raw. I had no history with Tony. I had no history really with Provincetown. I had summers on the Cape, but not Provincetown. And so I came at this with just reading the facts of this heinous killer and autopsy reports and so much more. And so as I'm writing, Liza is kind of fighting me on it. Like, well, he was really nice to me and I have no bad memories of him. And I said, sweetheart, I know he was nice to you. And I know that he took you for ice cream. And I know that he, was the cousin you never had. But we're dealing with an unspeakable criminal who was off the charts of even serial killers with how he desecrated the bodies. So, you've got to meet me at least halfway, if not 2/3 of the way, in describing the reality of, if not who he was to you, who he was in the world. And so,
there's a lot of work between us, but we managed. But we worked our butts off to make sure we had both sides of that personality, because I think it's important to put out there that these people are manipulators, and they're manipulators because of the biology and the genetics and the brain damage, and they know what you want to see. It's a function of the personality. And
Mhm.
so they can be very deceptive in who they present on a day-to-day basis. And I don't know whether that was going on. I was a kid. I don't know if that was going on, but I suspect it was, just knowing what I know now. But it was that was a tough go for us to make him human for me, and
Right.
then who he really was from an investigative standpoint. That was a tough thing.
Well, it's also more interesting. Two-dimensional characters aren't interesting.
Right, right.
I mean,
So true.
Hitler
So
is,
true.
Hitler's only interesting to read about when you see that he reacted or lived in a world with other people. And, he had
We
friends,
forget.
he had colleagues, he had people in his life, not just this, the Hitler that we all know. So for me as a writer and a journalist, I heard Liza's humanizing of him and said, okay, this is part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of the story because he was both things. He was a very gentle babysitter for her. He was a kind adult in her unkind world. But he was also, after he took them for ice cream, he was going to his grave sites in the Truro woods. So that's a fascinating, for me, as a character studier, a fascinating look into a broken psyche.
Right. And so, he raped his victims, he murdered his victims, he decapitated his victims and cut their bodies up, and sometimes certain body parts weren't even found, and he buried the victims. And
Yeah, don't sugarcoat this, Robert.
I hope everyone already ate their dinner. Or maybe not, I'm not sure. But I guess the question is why? Why did he do all these things?
Angry. In fact, I took the autopsy reports to a colleague of mine who is a doctor. And I said, you need to help me understand what I'm reading medically in these autopsy reports. And this man, poor thing, here I am in Salt Lake City, this very gentle Mormon, and he keeps looking up at me going, this is a very, very angry man. And what Tony did to those bodies, all post-mortem, by the way, as far as the autopsy reports are concerned, the attacks, the rapes, they were all post-mortem. A control issue, a rage issue, and a sense of making it right, like settling scores in obviously heinous and violent ways, but
and sickness.
And sickness, right?
And sickness. We know now what it takes, and it doesn't take much if you have if you have a disrupted frontal cortex and a particular genetic makeup. It doesn't take much trauma to sort of put the gas pedal down and have all hell break loose.
And we don't know what that childhood trauma was. We all have our guesses. Looking into his relationship with his mother, looking into his relationship with his deceased father and his stepfather, but we'll never know. All we know are, the crimes that he committed, and through them try to look at his psychopathy and try to figure out, stepping backwards, what may have caused it. But as Liza said, he has all three legs of the stool of psychopathy. And, we saw it, saw it in the victims.
Yeah. And so as a follow-up to that, we've somewhat touched on it already, but can we talk about his sad and sordid history? I know that there are allegations that in his childhood that he was raped by a teenager or a young man or something, that he was allegedly abused by a local priest. Can we talk, and certainly nothing excuses anything that he did in his adulthood, but can we talk a bit about his childhood?
Yeah, that we know, and more than allegations that he was raped. He told his wife that he had been raped, and she broadcast it on Facebook. So is that still an allegation? I suppose it's it's hearsay.
It's hearsay, yeah.
We're not hearing it from even the perpetrator, of course. But he certainly, alluded to it in the writings that Liza spoke of earlier,
He did.
in his prison diary and in his, fictional novel that he wrote in prison. So he alluded to that. But I mean, in looking at psychopathy, in looking at what makes a heinous serial killer, I think it goes before that rape. I think it goes earlier into childhood. To really break a psyche, you need to break the psyche before the psyche is formed. And that's what, 2, 3, 4 years old.
And let's remember, it doesn't take much.
Right.
Well, if you have the other two predispositions for that kind of mental illness, it doesn't take much.
And he definitely had the other two, which is genetic warrior gene, and a low functioning prefrontal cortex, which is most clearly shown in a total lack of empathy, which he wrote about. I mean, in writing about one of the murders, which he wrote about in terms of somebody else doing it and watching it, right. It was her fault. It was her fault. She laughed at me. So, I mean, as far, Liza and I are not psychotherapists, although we probably could be after all this. We certainly see the three-legged stool that he occupied.
It was really interesting that he denied, then confessed, then recanted, and then I'm not even sure how I would explain it, but like you said, like he said that he made up an individual, and he said that the individual did it, and that he I think he said he and I may be mixing up certain plot points here, but he maybe dismembered the bodies but didn't murder them or something.
Right. He came in as the guy who was trying to put someone out of their misery, right? He's painting himself as the savior, basically,
right.
in that situation.
Right. And the mafia cleanup guy.
Right.
The guy that had to come in and like clean up from his friend's heinous act.
Right.
He was always, and whether it was somebody else's fault or somebody else who committed the crime, or kind of the woman's fault for laughing at him or for belittling him. I mean, it was always somebody else's fault, no matter the degree of his confession. And he confessed in various ways and in various writings and in various interviews. And as you say, Robert, he recanted, but it was always with that, well, I may have been there, I may have not have been there, but it was ugly when I was there. I mean, that kind of
I don't even know how to explain it. Yeah. We'll talk about the trial a little bit later on. And folks, we're about at the halfway point. Start getting your comments and questions into the chat and into the Q&A. We'll get to them in about 15 minutes or so. I did want to, so for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the story, maybe haven't read the book yet, I'm going to throw a few names at you. Could you kind of explain who they are and their relationship to Tony? Who is Cecilia?
His mother
is his mother. And she was also really kind of central in my life growing up in Provincetown. She was a chambermaid at my mother and my aunt's hotel. And we were close to her. We loved her.
Avis.
Ex-wife, Tony's ex-wife.
Did they get along?
I'm sorry?
Evidently.
Did they get along?
Did Cecilia and Avis get along?
No, did Avis and Tony get along?
Well,
because I thought it was interesting that Avis wouldn't help the police really when they were investigating Tony.
No, she stonewalled the police.
Yeah.
She admitted to lying to the police, kind of giggling behind her hand that she lied to the police.
There's a great photograph on from the Globe of him coming out of the courthouse with his hands shackled and a cop in front of him and a cop behind him, and her sitting on those little stone wall reaching out for him.
Yeah, interesting relationship there.
Yes.
How about Callis? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Callis?
So Callis was the doctor, the local doctor who prescribed drugs for Tony when he complained of nervousness.
And can we talk about his dependence on drugs? He becomes an addict and he becomes a dealer, and because of his drugs.
Never an addict. He was never an addict, and this is one of the fascinating
Oh,
things
really?
that
Oh,
Liza
no.
and I discovered, that psychopathic personalities rarely become addicted to drugs because they're addicted to something else more powerful than drugs. And in Tony's case, it was
killing.
And so, yeah, I mean, when the day he was arrested was, of course, the last day he had any drug in his system whatsoever. And he never suffered withdrawal, not even an ounce. I mean, and they had a lot of psychiatrists and doctors watching him. He was on suicide watch at one point. Nobody ever discussed, wrote about any sign of withdrawal.
It's
So,
very common for them to abuse drugs,
right. He
Okay.
abused them, but he never.
but they don't become addicted.
Because I attributed that to the fact that he could never or rarely held down a job. He seemed to
Right,
have
right. I
difficulty.
think he was numbing the voice. I think he was numbing.
Right.
You know, he was self-medicating, voices in his head or whatever.
Okay.
You know, he knew what was happening to him.
Okay.
He had a sense what was happening to him. I personally feel he was trying to figure it out
Gotcha.
based on what he was reading and what was on his bedside and what he was arrested with. I think he he knew what was happening to him, and he even expressed it to people, didn't he?
Yeah.
Jen, he said to a friend of his in a bar one night, you know, sometimes I have some really dark thoughts, and Dickie Oldenquist just blew it off. But Tony said, no, you're not listening to me. I mean, really dark. So I think he knew.
So I next want to talk about the murders, and then we'll talk about him getting caught, and then we'll talk about the trial. So can you briefly discuss the timeline of the murders, how many murders were there, and what was Tony's relationship to these victims?
That's a huge question.
Be brief.
Yeah, as far as we know, the first murder was Labor Day 1968. The next murder was Memorial Day, first murder, second murder, Labor Day, third murder in New York, right around Thanksgiving, and the last two, the fourth and fifth murders, January of 69. That said, there are at least 5 more victims that are kind of in Tony's list that haven't been found. They've never been found. And there were 3 that were on his list that we discovered had survived him, but are still, if you Wikipedia him today, they are still in the books
Listed as his victims, yeah.
3 of Tony's victims, but they weren't. They survived Tony. They have since all died, but they survived Tony Costa. And his relationships to all 5, well, 3 of the 5 were girlfriends. The last 2 were circumstantial. They were in the same rooming house with him in Provincetown, and he, you know, bummed a ride with them out to the woods, and he killed them there. And we don't know the circumstances other than Tony saying that one of them laughed at him and probably said, I mean, I in my writer's brain was like, I bet she said, let's get the hell out of these woods. It's January, I'm cold. What the hell are we doing in these woods? Let's go back and have lunch in Provincetown. And he said, not so fast. And in fact, you know, to kill 2 victims at once is very rare, even for a serial killer. And the fact that he had them trapped in the woods is probably, you know, why he was able, or why he thought he could get away with it. And he did, until he was stupid enough to steal their car as well.
Right.
And
So
according to
let's talk
him, he
about-
was drugged up.
Yeah.
He was drugged up during that, yeah.
And I wanted to talk about that stolen car, because that I believe is plays into how he finally got caught. So can you sort of set the scene for us, and how did the police?
Yeah, I mean, that's why he got caught.
Yeah.
I mean, he was in Burlington, Vermont with the car. His mother called him and said, Tony, the police are asking about you because the girls were in the same rooming house and they were seen with you, and what can you say? And Tony called his buddy in the P-Town Police Department, and the guy said, yeah, we just, we got a few questions, but don't worry about it. Whenever you get back to town, that's fine.
I know.
Tony called the next day and said, okay, I'm coming back to P-Town. And Jimmy Mead, the cop, is like, well, what's your rush? Well, Jimmy, I have their car. And that started the down the rabbit hole for Tony Costa, because he couldn't quite remember the lies he started to tell.
Right.
And so, when more and more cops were brought in, they're like, well, yesterday you said this. Yeah, but I didn't mean that. This is what I really mean. So he finally hamstrung himself. And as you said earlier, Robert, the Keystone cops were still letting him go home at night and still letting him, roam the streets. And it wasn't until, the body was found that they're like, okay, you know what? We can't let this guy walk around anymore.
Yeah, I think the story around the car really just made no logical sense. He was trying to say that one of the women wanted to get an abortion and they were driving to Canada and he wanted a ride, but why would they give him a ride if he bought the car? And none of it made sense.
Yeah, I think it speaks to his disorganized mind. He was nuts.
Right.
He couldn't keep the stories straight.
Couldn't keep the stories.
Right.
And if he had just stopped, if he had just said, yeah, I borrowed their car, I left them at the bar in P-Town and I asked them to borrow the car.
And that's why I have it.
And that's why I have it. Here are the keys. I'll bring it back. But no, he couldn't. He had to rule the day and he had to impress the cops with how smart he was. So he kept going back to the police station day after day. And they were finally sick of him, like, Tony, all right, get a lawyer or something, but don't keep knocking on the door. He kept coming back and saying, I have one more thing to say. What I said yesterday wasn't quite it. So, it took them weeks to get the guy behind bars.
Right.
And speaking of places that he visited in town, it was only a paragraph in the book, but it was interesting that he frequented his local library and that he would read the dictionaries and the sources to learn new words, to sound impressive and intelligent. And you wrote that the librarian actually had a favorable impression of him. So makes me wonder how many serial killers I've come across in my 20 years in libraries.
Lonely librarians.
You
must have had that feeling once or twice.
No comment. I love all our patrons. They're all absolutely normal. So let's talk about the trial or lack thereof. I mean, can we talk about Tony's defense? Was it the drugs made me do it, and then it was sort of insanity, I guess, or whatnot? Can you talk a bit about that? How the trial went?
Yeah, the trial went. Goldman didn't really have many ways to defend him, so they decided to do the drugs made me do it, and. Help me out here, Jen, with the trial.
So, they of course tried insanity, and Tony was like, no.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Insanity. I'm not insane. In fact, I demand to take the stand. And they were like, no, Tony, you cannot take the stand. He said, well, then I want to tell my side of the story. So the court allowed him to make a statement. Right. And at the end of that statement, the prosecution attorneys looked at each other and said, well, Tony just made our case now, didn't he?
And Tony said, I think I won it. I won it.
Yeah, he walked up and told his attorney Goldman, like, oh my God, can you believe what I just did? Wasn't that brilliant? Like, you guys couldn't do it for me. I just did it. And the attorney's just like, oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah. So that was it. So nice. And of course, the evidence was overwhelming. I mean, he had no answer for any of, where Susan went, where Sydney went, where, so they went for, he may have done it, but the drugs made him do it. But then there's Tony saying, I'm perfectly sane. And I was never addicted to drugs. And I took a few uppers and downers, but everybody did. So. Yeah.
It's ironic that he sealed his own fate and didn't even realize it at the time. But this is a minor point, but it blew my mind that in a capital case, and perhaps the laws have changed, that in a capital case, the defendant can give a statement not under oath and not subject to cross-examination to the jury. That absolutely blows my mind. And in this case, it certainly backfired. But do we know if that's still the law today? That's
not the law today. That's not the law today. Most of what happened during that trial would never happen today, including the way in which they cross-examined his ex-wife and the way in which they interviewed his ex-wife. And I mean, they'd be in jail for harassment. So much of what went down would never in a million years. Well, first of all, Tony's lawyer would have been in jail himself because the first thing he did was when the ink wasn't dry on the arraignment. And he sat down Avis and he sat down Tony in the same room and he had them sign a paper to sign away their life rights. So anything, because that's how Goldman was going to get paid, because Tony and Avis couldn't pay him. So that would never happen today. So right from the get-go, it was, pardon my French, a shit show.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the end for Tony. So he is convicted. I think it takes the jury 6 hours or something. It's a very quick conviction. He goes to jail, and what is his fate? And also, if you want to tie it in ironically with another serial killer who happened to be in the very same jail.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he ended up in the same prison, perhaps the same prison block, and we couldn't find out which because the prison records have also since disappeared from Walpole. But he was in the same block, he was in the same prison with the Boston Strangler. And 6 months before Tony died, the Boston Strangler was killed in his cell. And I have always thought that Tony was also killed in his cell because egomaniacal psychopaths don't kill themselves because they're righteous. Tony always believed, and he wrote about, all I need to do is find a new attorney who's going to come in and show how innocent I am. Yeah, I was in the room. Yeah, I moved the body parts out of the bathtub, but I am innocent. And this lawyer is going to come in. I'm going to walk free, and my coterie and my acolytes are going to be on the streets of P-Town welcoming me home.
Right, conquering hero.
That's not the profile of a suicide. And particularly because we have his own words, we have his own writings. And in none of those writings is there a depressed man.
Right, and we have a letter, we have the multiple letters soliciting new attorneys, and he just gotten a new attorney.
Right.
So, I mean, we'll never know, but certainly the evidence we looked at leans toward not a suicide.
Right. And so we'll end it sort of with current events. So you all were supposed to have a book launch at a bookstore in Provincetown.
Correct.
Over the weekend or
last week, the
last
28th.
Weekend.
The 28th.
Gotcha. And I guess I'll just put it this way. What happened with that book launch?
So what happened is that we started getting, the bookstore started getting emails, threatening emails and nasty emails. And so we talked about canceling, and we said, absolutely not, we're not going to cancel. And then the next day, literally, there were hundreds of comments on the Provincetown community space of why we were basically blood-sucking bottom feeders to try and celebrate a book and wave it under the nose of Tony's family. That we should have more compassion than that, that we should, that both the bookstore and I were in it for the money. I mean, you name it, they said it. It was a lot of name calling, but the volume of it was very intimidating. So I called the police, as I said, and about 3 hours later, maybe 4 hours before the event was going to start, the bookstore called me and said his phone had been ringing off the hook and he thought we should cancel. And frankly, I was relieved.
Right.
Wrong. It's wrong. It should never have happened. And we'll continue to write about it because of that. I think this is the situation we're living in right now, where people think they can put a mob together and intimidate someone, and that's what they did. And they did it under the guise, and I call it a guise on purpose, of defending that family, because I have a lot of empathy for that family. I can't imagine what it's like to grow. And I had a tough parents, but this kind of takes the cake. So I have a lot of empathy for them, but they still can't shut down a book, and they still can't shut down a bookstore.
Well,
That's not the country we live in.
and they can't shut down history.
Right. I mean, right.
Tony Costa is part of the public record. And the fact that Liza had a personal interaction with him is part of the story. So, some of the emails that I received were, farcical and, fiction. It's like, wait a minute. First of all, have you read the book? No.
Fantasy.
None of these
people, no one's read the book. Yeah.
The most vehement commenters online said, I haven't read the book and never will. So what exactly are they protesting? And if they're protesting history, well, we're sorry. But you either married or had a father or lived with or knew a serial killer. And that's just an ugly reality, but it is reality. And shutting us down and shutting the book down doesn't erase that history. In fact, it magnifies it. We now have, national and international magazines and television shows calling us going, you want to talk about this? This is unbelievable. Provincetown of all places is shutting books down. So they've created a hue and cry that if they just kept their mouths shut, we would have had a nice, pleasant event with a little wine and cheese, and everyone would have, walked away. But no, instead they've created this, what will be an even bigger event, because you can't shut history down. And we're kind of seeing a lot of this right now in Congress with mob mentality and trying to shut down reality. Like you can't, it is, history is. And by ignoring it, you just magnify your own resistance to it.
Yeah.
And sadly, we're even seeing censorship attempts in public libraries now.
I'm sure you are.
Oh, yes.
Not here in Tewksbury, but in the profession as a whole. Anyway, I'm sorry that happened to you. Ironically, as you said, I think the online protest actually drew more attention to your book. And my understanding is there's another author who's published a book about this similar topic. And
he was canceled.
He was canceled as well. So yeah, you're not alone there. And there's going to be, I'm sure, films and documentaries and TV series made out of Tony's life. So hopefully the folks of Provincetown come around and realize that this, unfortunately for them, is not going away. So why don't we transition over to audience questions? We have about 10 minutes remaining. And I am so glad Ron asked this question, because it was going to be a question I asked if we didn't have audience questions. But we have like a dozen audience questions. Ron, this is for you, Liza. Please explain or describe more about your relationship with Tony as your babysitter. Did he do things with you, and what was his personality like?
Well, his personality, well, first of all, I describe him as, everyone has that older cousin and that you look up to. I had a female older cousin, a lot like Tony too. And one of the things he taught me to do was smoke. So, it was that kind of a relationship. And also, here's the thing, there were 4 of us in that truck oftentimes. It wasn't always that way. That there were multiple iterations of it. But he was this is not a man who wanted to be babysitting. He was babysitting because the owners of the motel were looking to get rid of us. And so, my aunt tells a great story about him coming up the driveway and her yelling out to the pool, "Here comes Tony." And out we'd come with our flip-flops and our towels. So, we drove all over town. I think I learned every song on AM radio in Tony's truck. He was just, I remember him as normal. I remember him as a little quirky, but nothing. I didn't feel the least bit of nefariousness. And it was happening at exactly the same time as he was murdering those women in town and then out in the woods. So it lined up directly. And that's what always freaked me out about it was, holy crap, that's how close I came. Actually, to this day, I can't actually take that in, of how close I was to that and how close my, cousins and siblings were to that.
As a follow-up, Bill wants to know, did you ever experience any anger from Tony at all, even the slightest?
No, not that I remember anyway. I mean, I had an incredibly angry mother. So that was where I was focused and afraid, not with Tony Costa. That's the irony of it.
And I always, let me chime in here. When I heard the story, and I first heard the story with Liza saying, I had a nightmare, 30 years later, and I finally identified my attacker in my nightmare as Tony Costa. Like, why would I do that? Tony was always gentle, always kind. And so again, the forensic journalist brain started thinking, well, wait a minute. I think that you probably did witness something. And I don't think it was against you, Liza, as a little girl, but I think she probably witnessed something in the woods, particularly because he took her out to the woods, that her psyche's protecting her from.
Well, and I did have memories, Jen. Remember, right. I did have those memories of things not associated with Tony. That connection was never made, but we used to laugh about it because, which I think is interesting, about the way we remembered some of the stories from Provincetown and nurses and organs outside the body and some of the myths that were perpetrated about what went down there. So I did have some disturbing stuff, but it was never connected to him directly.
Right. So the fact that 30 years later, she's having a nightmare with Tony, it says to me, she saw something that her psyche's protecting her from, and we don't know yet. We're waiting for that nightmare to come forward.
Well, and speaking of nightmares, Richard wants to know, Liza, did writing the book help you end your nightmares?
For the most part, not completely, but for the most part, that period of time was very, very intense. And it was always the same. And I was always running for my life, always with the weapons, always, trying to get away from somebody. Those dreams, for the most part, are gone.
Anonymous attendee asks, do you think his wife sensed his evil ways?
You want to answer that, Jen?
Well,
Anonymous?
We know she did, because she writes about it. I mean, we have, I don't know, I can't, how many printed pages we have from her Facebook pages, but she talks about having been very forewarned. Is that the right word? That
she didn't understand what she was looking at, I don't think. But...
Right. I mean, she described some very heinous behavior from Tony before they knew one body was buried. And when he was finally caught, she allowed us we all kind of knew.
She also talks about wanting to protect him, though, because she didn't want her family to think badly of him. So I think it was really multifaceted.
So she was protecting her children, totally understandable. But she in her own words talked about at least suspecting, let's put it that way. She at least suspected that there was something very dark going on with him and his now dead girlfriends.
And Jennifer, you gave us the quote earlier, but I want to go back to it. Ron asks, did Tony's mother ever suspect him of any of the crimes or of being psychotic? And did she ever get involved with the police investigation? And again, what did she tell investigators?
She was interviewed by the police several times. And in one of the interviews, she said, yeah. But if my Tony killed those girls, he must have had a good reason for it. So that was the mother's quote. And it was in the police reports. It was in, numerous accounts.
In the newspapers, numerous accounts.
So, I mean, do I think the mother knew? Yes, I do. And in fact, in Tony, in describing one of the most gruesome murders, which happened, the one murder that we know, that we suspect happened because of the evidence, not in the woods, that he transported the body parts to the woods to bury them. He talks about a mother, not his, again, the other, the true criminal's mother, walking in and not saying, oh my God, what have you done to this woman in the bathtub, but saying, clean this mess up.
Mhm.
And so, you know, to create that out of thin air, that a mother comes in and says, clean up the mess in my bathtub. So I mean, I think she witnessed a lot. We'll never know, you know, she died before the trial started, but boy, from Tony's own pen, he described his mother walking in and seeing body parts in the bathtub.
So let's wrap up with two questions here. The first one is from Kathleen. I'm going to skip some of the question here, but essentially she asks, do you think, can you talk about the psychology of the townies who were oppositional to the police and, in Kathleen's words, somewhat psycho in their support of Costa?
I think, again, it's really multifaceted, but two things in particular. I think, what are they afraid of? Because it doesn't make sense what they're doing. I mean, it makes sense that you'd want to protect a traumatized woman and her children, but the whole thing, the vehemence of it, and the specific attacks on me and on, you know, it doesn't make sense. Somehow they want to discredit this at every opportunity. It begs the question, why? And we don't really have a good answer for that. And the other thing I think you're looking at is a traumatized community. And I think when people are triggered, as this community was when my book showed up, you know, on their Provincetown community space, because I know that the vehemence is fear. Those kinds of comments, those kinds of attacks on people come from a place of fear. And the other thing I want to say about it is that when we started researching, this started happening. So we weren't entirely surprised. This has been going on through the whole process. Tony's ex-wife, the whole bunch of them have had a lot to say. And in one case, I was threatened with bodily harm. So, you know, for me, it comes from, they've got to be afraid of something.
And in almost every instance, because I, you know, reading through that online harangue, in almost every instance, we asked that individual person to participate.
For an interview.
You know, and they all stonewalled us. And the word was spread through that circle the wagons mentality in P-Town, don't talk to these women. And many didn't, but some did.
Right. And you make the point, Jen, and it's a really good one, that they say they don't have any idea who I am. And, you know, I'm kind of comfortable with that at this point. But Tony worked at the Royal Coachman, and Tony worked at Babysitter Bend, and Tony worked at all the, you know, he worked everywhere. And so they certainly relied on that money to support Avis and the kids. So they can't really, you know, I just, you know, it's a puzzle to me. And I kind of hope I never figure it out, because I'm pretty done with it, other than the idea of free speech, and shutting down people who are just telling a story that needs to be told. So that I will continue with, but the rest of it you can have. I mean, we can only tell our story.
We're going to end on a positive note. Teresa asks, so setting aside Tony Costa's family and friends and supporters, how has your book been received? Liza, what's your family's reaction been to the book? And what has the general public's reaction been?
That's a big question to wrap it up. My mother actually, my family all participated in the book. They all told their stories for the book. My mother actually, I think, was surprised to realize at some point she was elderly and she died right before it was released. You know, and her best friend who owned the motel across the street 6 months before that. So, but my brothers and sisters are, you know, they were all there. So,
yeah.
And to answer the larger question, Robert, the book has been incredibly well received. And we, we've been on several, best lists, starting with Amazon when it was first published. The launch that was canceled in P-Town last week was the paperback launch.
Right.
The hardcover came out a year before, and it's just, it was really incredibly gratifying.
Yeah.
See its response and to see the online comments and the readers' comments and the reviewers' comments. And yeah, I mean, all systems go. It's been very well received as both a memoir and a true crime nonfiction. So for both of us.
And we're working on a docuseries, so,
A docuseries, right.
Yeah, very creative hybrid, true crime and memoir. I liked. I listened to it on Audible. I really enjoyed it. It has the Robert Hayes stamp of approval for what that's worth. I'm going to read a few.
You can't beat the elevator pitch, and the elevator pitch is, my best friend was babysat by a serial killer.
There you go. I like it.
I mean, the elevator pitch takes 5 seconds.
Yeah, it's a good elevator pitch. It's attention grabbing. I'll read a few select comments from the chat, then I'll come back to both of you and ask if you have any last words, and then we're going to wrap it up. So Bill says, great story. Thanks for sharing. Marianne says, absolutely fascinating presentation. Cheryl says, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for sharing your story. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Marion says, thank you all. The truth is powerful. Candy says, thanks so much. Fascinating story. I can't wait to get a copy and read it. Great job, everyone. I could watch for another hour. Jen says, thank you so much for this opportunity and continuing to tell your story. I appreciate your time. I am disappointed by some of P-Town's response. Kathleen says, very riveting. Thanks for sharing your story. Cheryl, a different Cheryl says, wow, truth is stranger than fiction. So sorry for all the flack you are receiving. Barbara says, what a night. More to come, I'm sure. Hope your book sales soar. And let's talk about what's to come. So we'll wrap it up with any last words. You referenced a docuseries. Interested Liza and Jennifer to know what's next for both of you.
Go ahead, Jen.
I am always, working on the next project, but I'm suspicious in that, not suspicious. I'm superstitious.
Superstitious.
Thank you. In that I hate talking about projects that are still, still percolating.
Yeah.
So I do have, 2 story threads that I'm researching at this point. So stay tuned.
Nice.
And I am, in addition to working on the docuseries with Jen, I am also working on a book about the first 3 enslaved men who freed themselves as the Civil War was beginning in 1861. The first 3 men to come across Union lines. So it's kind of a fascinating story. So.
Well, Liza, when you publish that, I'm going to circle back and perhaps we'll have you in for that. So I want to thank a few folks. I want to thank Wellesley Books for being our official bookstore partner. Look for an email from me tomorrow with this recording, with a feedback survey, and with a link to purchase autographed copies of The Babysitter from Wellesley Books. I also want to thank the Corning Foundation and the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for being the primary sponsors. I want to thank the libraries in Wayland, Watertown, Somerville, Princeton, Norwood, North Reading, Northampton, Medfield, Chelmsford, Ashland, Newburyport, Wilmington, Wakefield, Mashpee, and Andover for joining Tewksbury for tonight's event. And most importantly, I want to thank Liza and Jennifer for a wonderful discussion. And I want to thank the 125 of us or so that watched.
And thank you, because we've done a lot of these, and this was incredibly professional, well organized, and really wonderful to work with you. So I just want to make sure I say that.
Liza, the check's in the mail. I appreciate
Rock
the kind
on.
words. All right, so thank you, Liza. Thank you,
Thank
Jennifer.
you.
A great job. Everyone have a wonderful night. Thanks so much.
You too. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, bye-bye.